Today's reading is from the book of Acts, chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now they were devout Jews from every people under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygias and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power." All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." The word of the Lord.
Little ominous sounds here to get us started. There you go. Now this is a reading from Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had bricks for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the earth. Ideas can be like diseases. They spread from one person to another, and they can cover a whole community. At some point in our history, thousands of years ago, somebody came up with the idea that they could enhance their lifestyle by taking advantage of somebody who was vulnerable and taking things from them. And they believed that that was a fine thing to do. That idea caught on. And then it got supercharged when we came up with probably the biggest technological innovation of humankind, agriculture. No longer did people have to be involved as a whole tribe hunting for food and gathering food. Now one farmer could raise enough food to feed many people. And wealth, as measured in grain, could be accumulated in huge amounts. And in places like Babylon, which was in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and had wonderfully rich soil and plenty of water and great climate, huge amounts of food could be built up. And that food could be power. That could represent wealth, power that could be used to have people to do other things than farm. They could be builders. They could be scholars. Can we turn the sound down just a bit? They could be builders and they could be scholars. Thank you. And they could be soldiers. And using that idea that you can take from the vulnerable to give to the powerful, they scattered out and started attacking other cities and adding and creating an empire. So now imagine that you are a resident of the city of Jerusalem. And you think you're in the center of the world. It's a big city, it has big walls, it has big buildings, it has this beautiful temple. You think you are in the center of the world. People from all over the world, mostly Jewish people, come to Jerusalem to give their tithes and their offerings at the temple. It feels very cosmopolitan. There's so many talented people in town. And then one day, about 587 years before Jesus, the Empire of Babylon invades. And they quickly take your army out, and they quickly invade your country, and they knock down the thick walls of Jerusalem, and they take everything of value, and they tear down the temple, and they take the people in Jerusalem, the educated elite, the craftspeople, the artists, the scholars, the religious leaders, the political leaders, the economic leaders. They take them all and move them across the desert and resettle them in Babylon. And when you get to Babylon, you realize what a dinky place Jerusalem was. Babylon was huge, so much bigger than Jerusalem. The walls in Babylon were huge. They made the walls of Jerusalem look like a picket fence. The buildings in Babylon were huge. They didn't just build buildings, they built mountains. They took the clay and the soil and they made bricks out of it, and they glued those bricks together with tar from the oil that was everywhere present in the Middle East, and they made these mountains. I stood on one of those mountains in southeast Iraq, in the city of Ur, the birthplace of Abraham, a mountain rising up out of the desert, built by human beings. The people carried into Babylon would have been awed beyond belief. The size of the city, the scope of the city, the wealth, the artistry, the people from all over the world gathered there. It would have felt like the very center of the world. And people would have been overawed. And those people from other nations that were captured and brought there undoubtedly believed, because their gods were similar to the gods of Babylon, that Babylon was the winner. It was the place to be. It was the people to be. So they gave up their identities and they became Babylonians. They gave up their gods and started worshiping the Babylonian gods. It made sense. But these Jewish people, they had a different history. They believed that their ancestors were not the conquerors, but the victims of conquerors, that their ancestors were slaves. And that the God, the one true creator God, stood with them, with the slaves, and not the conquerors. Imagine you're one of those conquered people from Jerusalem sitting in some hovel in Babylon in the shadow of these immense buildings. And the storyteller comes around some night and tells you the story of Babel, about a giant community where people from the whole earth gathered, and they built these amazing towers so tall that they could storm heaven. That they took bricks and mortar, like the bricks and mortar in Babylon, and they built these amazing structures. And then the God, the one true God, the God of Israel, came down and looked at it all and said, I don't think so. And made it so that they didn't understand each other. That's how the Bible puts it. They didn't understand each other. And they became divided. But that word in Hebrew, understand, is the word Shema. And Shema often means listen to or hear. And I think that's a more accurate translation. They stopped listening to each other. And things fell apart. From that story and other stories, the Jewish people that were there in Babylon didn't become Babylonians. They maintained their identity as Jewish people. They understood that their God was bigger than the empire of Babylon. They understood that their truth was bigger than the truth of their conquerors. They understood that this whole enterprise of empire was going to fall apart at some point because God had baked into creation the fall of places like Babylon. And so they settled down and they waited because they knew the time would come when their captors would fall apart. And 50 years later, the Persian Empire invaded Babylon, destroyed it, and the Jewish people were able to go back home. The story of Pentecost is the reversal of the story of Babylon. The story of Pentecost is not about the conquerors and the winners. The story of Pentecost is about the losers, the followers of Jesus. That was their identity. They were the followers, disciples. They were the people who were learning from the master. That was their identity. They'd given up everything else. They were no longer fishermen. They were no longer the people who lived in this village or this village. They were disciples of Jesus. And they believed that they were on the right track, that Jesus was going to be the Messiah, that Jesus was going to step into a position of power and authority and lead the Jewish people to create a nation that was free from invasion from people like the Romans, and a nation that would be forever at peace and enjoy the prosperity that God had promised them, and that they would live outside of fear and want. And Jesus was going to get them there. And when Jesus rose to power, they would rise with Jesus. But then Jesus came to Jerusalem, challenged the people in authority, and rather than conquering them, he was arrested by them, put on trial, legally murdered by them. And they were people without a leader, followers with no leader. Fearful that what happened to Jesus would happen to them. They were in hiding. They were confused. They thought Jesus was the Messiah, but Jesus didn't end up becoming the Messiah. Israel didn't push out the Romans. The Romans were still in power. The Romans killed Jesus. What did all of that mean? What was it all about? Did Jesus get it wrong? Did they get it wrong for believing in Jesus? They couldn't figure it out. And so they stayed in hiding, they lived in fear, and they cried about the loss of their master. They sought to understand the confusion. They prayed, they talked, they waited. And then one day, it happened. When I was a kid and watching cartoons, when somebody would have an idea, a light bulb would pop up over their heads. They didn't have light bulbs back then, so it was a fire. They had an idea. The Spirit of God came to them. I think it probably happened like popcorn. You know, this person said, oh, but this happened, and Jesus said that, and this, and that. And pretty soon they understood, as a community gathered together, hidden away, they understood that Jesus had it right all along, that Jesus was the Messiah, not the Messiah of their expectations, not the Messiah of the expectations of the Jewish people, but the Messiah that represented the will and power of God, which is love. And love doesn't conquer. Love isn't violent. Love doesn't use force. Love transforms. Love forgives. Love endures. They understood that Jesus was on the right track. It wasn't about building the secure and prosperous kingdom of Israel. It was about building the faithful kingdom of God. Much bigger, much more important. And they threw open the doors and they went out into the marketplaces and the places where people were gathered, and they started proclaiming that Jesus was in fact the Messiah, that the leaders who had killed them had gotten it all wrong, that Jesus was the Messiah. The truth that Jesus offered the world was the truth the world needed. And they said it without fear, and they said it because they knew that the love of God lived longer than people's lives, that the love of God would be there long after their death. They had nothing to fear anymore. And people understood. We celebrate that awakening every year at this time, the day of Pentecost. We burn candles, sometimes with less breeze, so that they last a little bit longer, but we burn them. Celebrate the fact of that fire, that insight, that enlightenment that came and is still available to all of us. The Spirit of God within us, around us, leading us, cajoling us. We live in a time when things are fractured. People don't listen to each other. We are divided. We live in a time when our government doesn't seem to be working anymore because people can't work across party lines for the common good. We live in a time where people can't talk to each other about basic things like religion and politics because we're so fractured. We don't want to listen to each other. We live in a time when this story, this Pentecost story, the story of the love of God overcoming every obstacle, every division, this story is more important than ever. That's our calling, you see, to bear that story to the world, to say that there's something more important than which party wins which election, that which bill gets passed, which person gets this amount of money or has that big of a house. It's more important than anything else, this love of God that allows us to listen to the people that we've been taught not to listen to the people who are the victims of our social order, listen to the people who are suffering because of the world as it is. And in that listening, to create the world that can be. The realm of God, a world built on love, on our ability to stop and ignore all of those that want us to be divided, that want us to find an enemy, that want us to find a scapegoat, that want us to find somebody to hate, to blame, that want us to be separate, that want us to ignore everything but the truth that they say is true. That we have a truth that's bigger than all of that. A very simple truth. God is love. God calls us to love our neighbors as ourselves, as a reflection of our love for God. And if we build a world based on that basic, simple truth, it will be paradise. A simple truth, a gift to us, a spirit that is always pushing us to awaken to that amazing, transforming truth of the love of God. On this day and every day we gather here, we celebrate that truth. And that's good news.